Some people say that mass immigration into the United States can help reduce world poverty. Is that true? Well, no, it's not. And let me show you why. This gumball represents the 1 million legal immigrants that the United States has taken every year on average since 1990. Now, who in the world deserves our humanitarian compassion? The World Bank has one measure of the desperately poor of the world. They make less than $2 a day. And how many people make less than $2 a day in the world? Well, let's start with Africa. In Africa alone, there are 650 million people who make less than $2 a day. 650 million. And in India, another 890 million people, desperately poor. China adds another 480 million people, making less than $2 a day. And unfortunately, the rest of Asia has a heartbreaking 810 million people who the World Bank says make less than $2 a day. And finally, there's 105 million of Latin America's population that are desperately poor. All told, the World Bank says there are 3 billion people in the world, 3 billion people who are desperately poor, making less than $2 a day. That's 3,000 gumballs. And every year, we take 1 million and suggest that we've somehow made a humanitarian difference. Of course, we don't pull our immigrants from these desperately poor populations, do we? These people are too poor, too sick, too disconnected to make it here as immigrants. We tend to pull our immigrants out of the better off poor of the world. And Mexico tends to define the type of immigrant that we bring here because the plurality of people come from Mexico. And Mexico is poor. How many people in the world live in countries that have average incomes lower than that of Mexico? And the World Bank tells us that that number is these 3 billion plus another 2.6 billion people. 5.6 billion people in the world who live in countries with average incomes below that of Mexico. That's 5,600 gumballs. And so what is it that the elites are telling us? They're telling us that when we take this 1 million immigrants, that we somehow or another are tackling world poverty. And we have to do it regardless of the effect on our unemployed, the working poor, the most vulnerable members of our society, regardless of the effect on our natural resources.
There is something appalling about being condescended to by an elite as stupid and as wrong-headed as the elites that govern the Western world over the last couple of generations have been. And I say that in a partisan way. Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, Lena Dunham and Amy Schumer, just to name other great thinkers of our time, they carry on like English Protestant absentee landlords in Irish Catholic rural Ireland a century ago. They do not live where the people they presume to govern live, and eventually people get sick of that.
We couldn't make a noticeable difference. And we may be really hurting the impoverished people of the world because the million that we do take are among the most energetic, often the better educated, certainly the most dissatisfied people that if they did not immigrate would be the agents for change to improve the lot of all the people in these countries. The true heroes in the global humanitarian field are the people in these countries who have the wherewithal to immigrate to another country, but instead stay in their countries, to apply their skills to help their fellow countrymen. Unfortunately, our immigration system tends to entice these very type of people to abandon their countrymen. The impossibility of making even a dent is actually worse than it looks here. Because last year, when we took 1 million immigrants, these countries added, births over deaths, 80 million more people into the impoverished population. And this year, Congress is bringing in 1 million legal immigrants. And this year, according to the United Nations, these countries are expected to add another 80 million people.
Dr. Ahn quoted to me the Lincoln line about a house divided earlier today. And I think we're living in an interesting time in which the two factions do not even agree on what the house is. Is it a home or is it merely some kind of cheap lodging house that is simply open up to anybody who can get here? Is it no more special than Gate 27 at Phoenix Airport? Is it just a collection of whoever happens to be standing in it at any one time? That's basically what the elite's view of America and the elite's view of nationhood is.
Are you saying that the variable in success or lack of success is the culture of the particular group?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm saying it not only for the United States, but in terms of the studies of various other countries around the world, the same thing seems to be true. You not only find the same group having the same characteristics in country after the country. That is, the Germans produced the first pianos in Australia. They created the piano industry in the United States. They built the first pianos in England. They built the first pianos in Russia. You look at the Chinese, what they major in Malaysia in college is what they major in the United States in college.
Namely science and
Science and technology, heavily. And this follows the group around the world. So the notion that the group is a creature of society, that society has shaped the group, just will not stand up to the fact.
The Ninth Circuit Court, in its infinite wisdom, now says that the President of the United States cannot target even six, putting Iran aside for the moment, but six utterly failed, dysfunctional non-states and distinguish between them, distinguish between a Somali who's got 6 brothers fighting for Al-Shabaab, and 4 of them have already blown themselves to kingdom come and are enjoying their virgins in paradise. You're not allowed to distinguish between that guy and a Toronto snowbird going to his condo in Florida for 6 weeks in the winter. That is what the Ninth Circuit says. More importantly, astonishingly, it says you can't distinguish between American citizens and the 6.7 billion people on the planet who are not American citizens.
We'll bring in another 1 million immigrants, and these countries, unfortunately, will be adding another 80 million people into these impoverished nations. We could take 5 million a year, but we'd never get ahead of what's happening in these countries, not in this century. Don't you see? Immigration can never be an effective or significant way to deal with the suffering people of the world. They have to be helped where they live. 99.9% of them will never be able to immigrate to a rich country. There's no hope for that. They have to bloom where they're planted. The only place that 99.9% of these people can be helped is where they live. Let's help them there.
You could ask yourself, is multiculturalism in favor of social change or not? That is a very important question. And I would say that multiculturalists, as being leftists, or defended by people who perceive themselves as being leftists, they have a problem with the idea of social change. Because if all we have to do when we see exotic, quote-unquote exotic cultures, is to recognize these cultures, because that's what also multiculturalism is about. It's about a kind of peaceful, passive recognition of the other and the culture of the other. Then there is an imminent risk that these cultures will not change. And, myself being a modernist, I think there is a problem with this, because, and this is a dangerous thing to say, you might jeopardize a lot of things. It's a dangerous thing to say that it might be a good thing for certain cultures to change. And for instance, their approach to women, for instance, their approach to the state, the idea of the state, a transition from the clan or from the tribe to the state. and notions such as freedom of speech, etc. And because if you say this, people, you're asking for trouble, because people will tell you, well, so you think you're better than anybody else. Of course I'm not better, but I do think that there are certain cultures who have maybe been able to deal with certain things in a better way than other cultures. If you talk about Jews in Malmö, the official discourse was that the Jews in Malmö were harassed by Swedish neo-Nazis. But if you go to Malmö and have a look, you will not find many neo-Nazis. There might be one or two, but they are not responsible for the fact that the Jews in Malmö have left. Basically, they have left. So the threat, the reason why the Jews in Malmö have left is because they have been attacked by Muslims. Not all Muslims, of course, but Muslim groups and mostly Muslim young men. And you can't say this, even though it is true.
John Kerry told graduates at Northeastern this summer, you're about to graduate into a borderless world. And for those guys, it is a borderless world in a sense. They're the kind of people who'll graduate and they might take a job with Goldman Sachs in New York, and then the job will come up in Hong Kong for a couple of years, and then they might move on to Geneva, and then they'll come back to Boston and maybe go to London for a couple of years. And the world is borderless. At that level, for them, it's a borderless world. It's Switzerland at its best, Sweden at its worst. For the masses, for the rest of the people of America and the Western world, a borderless world isn't quite so glamorous. And they have figured out that the way it's headed, and that for them a borderless world will be less like Switzerland than Sudan. And they do not want to live in John Kerry's borderless world.
So there are certain things you can't say, even though they're true. And there are other things you're free to say, even though they are not true, So what you say as a multiculturalist, you go on saying the right things, which are wrong, but you can say them, and you should say them, because it protects you and it gives you a lot of friends, and you can write a lot of articles, and everything you say is bogus, but it doesn't matter. So social reality no longer matters.
I think it's worth following the logic of what happens. Dr. Ahn is a great constitutional scholar. He teaches the US Constitution at Hillsdale. If what the Ninth Circuit says is true, that in effect the United States Constitution applies to all 7 billion people on the planet, it's essentially now like one of those bad class action suits where you can be signed up for it even though you'd never, you can be living on the other side of the globe and suddenly you discover you're bound by the US Constitution. If the US Constitution applies to everybody, it applies to nobody. If the privileges of American citizenship apply to everybody, then they apply to nobody. Because the central act of citizenship, the central quality of citizenship, that it is about your home and where you belong, the Ninth Circuit Court now says no longer matters. And the effect is to entirely negate the value of citizenship.
I think England is the best example if you want to talk about the failures of multiculturalism, but I think, save for Sweden, I think Sweden is an even better example. In Sweden, for instance, in academia, you have a hegemonic discourse, and it means that people are afraid to speak up, and this is dangerous, because then you no longer have a discussion about things. You have people who, they wave their finger and they try to find out where the wind is blowing, and then they go in this direction. So you create a situation where people are nervously looking for appeal. They are nervously looking for maximum number of appreciation.
I've always maintained multiculturalism doesn't work, that in fact what we end up with is a nation of ghettos. I think that's true here in the UK. And I think what we see is that migrants arrive, and typically because we now have so many economic migrants who haven't actually suffered war or endured real hardship, that they really want to create a country within a country. They don't see Islam as compatible with Western culture, Western values. So actually they would rather live alone, separate from our society. Certainly around 23% of British Muslims have said that they would prefer and look to live under Sharia law rather than any laws that we have here. So I certainly feel that when people talk about integration, for me, I always hear the word colonization, because I think that's what's happening across Europe as we have opened our arms and our borders and told everyone to come and effectively take over.
And in society, also in politics, you have also a situation where there are a lot of things that you're not allowed to say. And you have, most of all, I would say, you have a situation where everything is being polarized. Where you have, I mean, if you would like to create a situation where you have right-wing fanatics who say all kinds of bizarre things, and then on the other hand you have the multiculturalists who say the opposite things, then you should have a look at the last few years in Sweden, because I think politicians, journalists, and the academia has, whether they know it or not, they have carefully created a situation which is, I would think, on the brink of explosion.